The Vietnam War was a long and brutal conflict. It lasted from 1955 to 1975. The war had a profound impact on Vietnam, the United States, and the world. It was a war that stemmed from complex historical roots. To understand the war, we must first understand Vietnam's long struggle for independence. For centuries, Vietnam had been ruled by foreign powers. After World War II, Vietnam had a chance for independence. However, the country was divided. In the north, Ho Chi Minh emerged as a powerful leader. He was a communist revolutionary. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces wanted a unified Vietnam under communist rule. In the south, a different vision took hold. Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the United States, opposed communism. He wanted a separate, non-communist South Vietnam. This division was formalized in 1954 with the Geneva Accords. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. Elections for reunification were promised but never happened. This set the stage for the conflict to come. The division of Vietnam reflected the broader Cold War tensions. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, saw Vietnam as a critical battleground. They believed in the domino theory. This theory stated that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. The stage was set for a proxy war between the superpowers. The escalating conflict in Vietnam would have far-reaching consequences. The war in Vietnam was more than just a military conflict. It was a clash of ideologies, a struggle for national identity, and a tragedy for millions. The seeds of this conflict were sown in the years following World War II. They would grow into a war that would shape a generation. The conflict in Vietnam escalated gradually. It began with the United States providing military aid to South Vietnam. President Dwight Eisenhower saw supporting South Vietnam as crucial to containing communism. As the situation intensified, the U.S. involvement grew. President John F. Kennedy sent military advisors to train South Vietnamese forces. However, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Viet Cong communist guerrillas in the south gained strength. They received support from North Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This clandestine network of paths and roads wound through Laos and Cambodia. It provided a vital supply line. The Viet Cong, with their knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics, posed a significant challenge to US and South Vietnamese forces. Their resilience and determination proved to be a decisive factor in the war. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. This was a confrontation between US and North Vietnamese naval forces. Although the details remained contested, it led to a dramatic escalation. The US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate US military involvement in Vietnam. This marked a turning point. The United States was now directly engaged in a full-fledged war in Southeast Asia. The escalation of the Vietnam War was a complex process. Driven by Cold War anxieties, the US found itself increasingly drawn into the conflict. The commitment to containing communism, coupled with miscalculations and a determined enemy, would have profound consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a turning point in the Vietnam War. It was a coordinated series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. They targeted cities and military installations throughout South Vietnam. The offensive took the US and South Vietnamese forces by surprise. It shattered the perception that the US was winning the war. Although the offensive was militarily a failure for the communists, it was a strategic victory. The Tet Offensive had a profound impact on public opinion in the United States. The ferocity and scale of the attacks contradicted the optimistic assessments of the war effort. The American public, once largely supportive of the war, began to question the government's handling of the conflict. The Tet Offensive fueled the anti-war movement. It led to a loss of confidence in the Johnson administration. The Tet Offensive exposed the limitations of US military might. Despite superior firepower and technology, the US struggled to defeat a determined and elusive enemy. The jungle terrain and guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong proved highly effective. The war was becoming increasingly costly. Public support for the war was waning. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point. It showed that the Vietnam War would be a long and difficult struggle. The Tet Offensive had a profound impact on the Vietnam War. It shook public confidence in the United States. It exposed the resilience of the communist forces. It marked a turning point in the conflict. The war would continue for 7 more years. but the Tet Offensive cast a long shadow. It forever changed the way the war was perceived. The Vietnam War inflicted deep scars on Vietnam and its people. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were caught in the crossfire. Their lives were shattered by the relentless fighting. The war left an indelible mark on the country's landscape and psyche. The human cost of the war was staggering. It is estimated that between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese civilians died during the conflict. The war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield. The use of napalm and Agent Orange had devastating environmental and health consequences. Napalm, a highly flammable jelly-like substance, caused horrific burns. Agent Orange, a herbicide, was used to defoliate forests. It contaminated vast areas of land. This contamination continues to affect the health of Vietnamese people today. The war left a legacy of physical and emotional trauma. Millions of Vietnamese people were displaced from their homes. They lived in constant fear of bombing raids and ground fighting. The war shattered families, destroyed communities, and left deep psychological wounds. The scars of war run deep in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a tragedy for all involved, but it was the Vietnamese people who bore the brunt of the suffering. Their resilience in the face of such adversity is a testament to the human spirit. However, the war's legacy continues to cast a shadow over Vietnam. It serves as a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of conflict. Section 5. The Weight of Dissent. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition to the war grew within the United States. The anti-war movement gained momentum. It drew support from students, civil rights activists, veterans, and ordinary citizens. They questioned the war's purpose and criticized its conduct. The anti-war movement became a powerful force in American society. The My Lai massacre in 1968 further fueled the anti-war movement. US soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women and children. The massacre, which was initially covered up, sparked outrage and horror when it became public. It eroded support for the war and deepened the moral divide in American society. The anti-war movement used various tactics to raise awareness and pressure the government. Protests, marches, and demonstrations became common occurrences. Students organized teach-ins and campus strikes. Musicians and artists used their platforms to express their opposition to the war. The anti-war movement reflected a deep division within American society. It challenged the government's authority and raised questions about the country's role in the world. The Vietnam War was a turning point in American history. It sparked a period of social and political upheaval. The anti-war movement forced Americans to confront difficult questions about war, peace, and their nation's role in the world. The legacy of the anti-war movement continues to shape American politics and society today. Section 6. A gradual retreat. By the early 1970s, the United States was seeking a way out of the Vietnam War. Public support had dwindled, and the war had become increasingly unpopular. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, promised to end the war. He implemented a policy of Vietnamization. This involved gradually withdrawing US troops. It meant turning over more responsibility for the fighting to the South Vietnamese. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973. They marked the official end of US involvement in the Vietnam War. The accords called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all US troops, and the release of prisoners of war. However, the accords did not address the underlying political divisions in Vietnam. Despite the signing of the peace accords, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were determined to reunify the country under communist rule. The South Vietnamese, weakened by years of war and dependent on US support, struggled to resist. The US withdrawal left a power vacuum in Southeast Asia. It had significant geopolitical implications. The US withdrawal from Vietnam was a complex and controversial process. It was driven by a number of factors. These included domestic pressure, military realities, and changing geopolitical considerations. The withdrawal marked the end of a long and costly war. It had profound consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. Section 7. The Fall of Saigon. The Paris Peace Accords proved to be a temporary truce. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive. They quickly overwhelmed the South Vietnamese forces. As the North Vietnamese approached Saigon, the South Vietnamese government collapsed. Panic ensued as people tried to flee the city. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. It marked the fall of South Vietnam and the end of the Vietnam War. The images of helicopters evacuating people from the roof of the US Embassy became iconic. They symbolized the chaotic end to America's longest war. The fall of Saigon had a profound impact on the people of Vietnam. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history. For the United States, the fall of Saigon was a humiliating defeat. It led to a period of national soul-searching. The war had cost the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers. It had deeply divided the nation. It also raised profound questions about US foreign policy and the limits of American power. The fall of Saigon marked the end of an era. The Vietnam War ended in a communist victory. It had a profound impact on the political landscape of Southeast Asia. For the Vietnamese people, it was a time of both triumph and tragedy. The war had left its mark on the country, but it also ushered in an era of peace and reunification. Section 8. The Enduring Legacy. The Vietnam War continues to cast a long shadow over the United States and Vietnam. It was a war that had a profound impact on both countries. It shaped their domestic politics, foreign policies, and national identities. The war's legacy is complex and multifaceted. In the United States, the Vietnam War left a legacy of division and distrust. It divided the nation along political lines. It eroded trust in the government. The war also led to a reassessment of US foreign policy. The United States became more reluctant to intervene militarily in foreign conflicts. It adopted a more cautious approach to international affairs. In Vietnam, the war left a legacy of physical and emotional scars. The country was devastated by years of fighting. Millions of people were killed or wounded. The war also left behind a legacy of environmental degradation. Despite the challenges, Vietnam has made remarkable progress in the decades since the war. The country has been reunified. It has experienced significant economic growth. It has become a more active player on the international stage. The Vietnam War was a defining event of the 20th century. It had a profound impact on the United States, Vietnam, and the world. The war's legacy continues to shape our understanding of war, peace, and the role of the United States in the world. Section 9. Global Echoes. The Vietnam War had significant global implications. It was a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a clash between communism and capitalism. The war had a profound impact on the Cold War rivalry. It contributed to the global spread of anti-war sentiment. The war also had a significant impact on the developing world. It fueled nationalist movements. It inspired revolutions. The war showed that even small countries could resist the might of superpowers. It highlighted the human cost of Cold War ideologies. The Vietnam War also had a lasting impact on the way wars are fought. It showed the limitations of conventional military tactics. It demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare. The war also raised important questions about the ethics of war. It led to international conventions against the use of certain weapons. The Vietnam War was a global event. It had a profound impact on the course of history. It continues to shape our understanding of war, peace, and international relations. The lessons of Vietnam remain relevant today. They serve as a reminder of the human cost of conflict. They highlight the importance of diplomacy and peaceful resolution.